I've come to speak to you about how God fools the atheists. And I want to start with one of the famous ones, Bertrand Russell, the great 20th century atheist, who was asked what he would say if in his death he met God. And he replied, "Why didn't you give us more evidence?" It's more than a blame shift from Russell to God. It's also an expression of the arrogant folly of Enlightenment atheism. Similarly, when our Gough Whitlam was asked what he would say to his maker, he replied, "Well, you can be sure of one thing. I shall treat him as an equal." This morning I wanted to look at one verse, namely 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 21. The context of chapters 1 and 2 of 1 Corinthians is human boasting, and the answer Paul is giving is the gospel message of the cross. I'll read verses 20 and 21 to give the immediate context. "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God, through the folly of what we preach, to save those who believe." And I want to start off by considering the wisdom of the world, in particular that which has afflicted most of us, the atheism of our age. It's come from the 18th century Enlightenment, which was a great movement of the mind that Christians contributed to. It fought against superstition, choosing to live not by ideologies, but by evidence, by universal reason and experience, by rationalism and empiricism, if you like to put it in those terms. But while Christians contributed to this, indeed the Reformation was the foundation of it, the Enlightenment took a decided atheistic bent, replacing God with man, replacing revelation with reason. So my Oxford Companion of Philosophy gives a 6-point summary of the Enlightenment. 1. Reason is man's central capacity, and it enables him not only to think, but also to act correctly. 2. Man is by nature rational and good. 3. Both an individual and humanity as a whole can progress to perfection. This is a total denial of Christian understanding. And though many Enlightenment figures moved to deism rather than atheism, the movement headed to atheism. You can see this if you compare the Humanist Manifestos of 1933, 73 and 2003. The earliest ones spoke of religious humanism, the later ones of secularist humanism. By 1973, one still had a place for religion, its beneficial effects for people, but by 2003 there was no place. Knowledge was derived by observation experiment. Humans are only really part of an unguided process of this nature. Ethical values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. Life's fulfillment emerges in individual participation. The work to benefit society maximizes individual happiness. There's no place for God in any of the 2003 statement. Our existence is meaningless. Our morality is self-interested happiness, expressed all in Orwellian kind of double talk. But let's get back to our verse here in 1 Corinthians. God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. Now, how has he done this? Well, verse 21 explains that in his wisdom, the world didn't know him through wisdom. Notice first that it was his choice. He thought it was best that by human wisdoms we did not know, we would not know, we couldn't know him. He was not going to be found either in Greek philosophy or in their love of wisdom, nor in Jewish signs, their love of miracles. But to put it in modern terms, neither in our rationalism nor in our empiricism would he allow himself to be found by humans. This means by the very heart of the Enlightenment, of modern humanism, namely rationalism and empiricism, atheists like Richard Dawkins could never find God, would fail to find God. God is there, but he refuses to be known that way. The foolishness of atheism has increasingly become apparent as postmodernism has taken over from that failed Enlightenment experiment. Pure rationality was always a myth, for rationalist philosophies always have some unprovable foundations upon which they're built. Combining it with empiricism doesn't help because it still relies on unprovable foundations. Consequently, by the 21st century, atheism has plunged the world into meaninglessness, and consequently amorality and illiteracy. Listen to Richard Dawkins on the purpose of life. We reach out in our search for meaning until we suddenly realise it is we who actually provide the purpose in a universe that would otherwise have none. And without any purpose, listen to him on morality. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. No evil, no good. So then where can justice be found? Lord Denning, not everybody's cup of tea, I understand, the master of the rolls from the 1960s to the 80s, he warned, without religion, there can be no morality. And without morality, there can be no law. And if religion perishes in the land, truth and justice will also. It's a stark warning he gave. But as the philosopher Professor Jesse Prince of City University of New York wrote, another atheist of course, no amount of reasoning can engender a moral value, because all values are at bottom emotional attitudes. The judgment that something is morally wrong is an emotional response. This atheism plunges us into the insanity of a Kafka world, the Nietzschean quest for power, the Orwellian newspeak that we see all around us. A world where power defines everything. And sadly, Mao was right. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. A world where the deconstruction is transforming public debate into power games of language. The public atheist Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy and law at New York University, wrote a book called What Does It All Mean? It's about life in general, and he concludes, but what's the point of being alive at all? There's no point. It wouldn't matter if I didn't exist at all, or if I didn't care about anything. But I do. That's all there is to it. He continues, if life is not real, life is not earnest, and the grave is its goal, perhaps it's ridiculous to take ourselves so seriously. On the other hand, if we can't take ourselves so seriously, perhaps we just have to put up with being ridiculous. And so he concludes his book, Life may be not only meaningless, but absurd. The sheer absurdity of atheism has created the postmodern world. But nobody wants to be operated on by a postmodern surgeon, or have a postmodern auditor, or a postmodern judge and jury. The failure of Enlightenment atheism is all around about us today, but its real failure is found right back in its foundation, for it excluded God by limiting reality and human nature to rationality and empiricism. We always have the problem of personal relationships. Personal relationships require something more. They require revelation and willingness and trust. Nobody knows another person without revelation, and nobody has a friend without trust. Take my sister, for example. What can you tell me about my sister? Rationalism can tell you she's female and she has a brother. But notice that's just tautology. It's just definitional from the meaning of the word sister. You're not telling me anything real about my sister. Why? You don't even know if I have a sister. Empiricists could tell us how much she weighs and the colour of her hair and the colour of her eyes and her height and her age, but they can't tell us anything about her, the person, not unless she's willing to talk. For it's the spirit of a person who knows the person and anybody she's willing to talk to. Look across at chapter 2 and verse 11. For who knows the person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. As with my sister, so with God. To know her requires her to reveal herself to you. To know God requires him to reveal himself to you. But what if she's unwilling? What if God's unwilling? What if he doesn't want us to know him? What if there's conflict? Lawyers of all people should know firsthand how hard it is to create friendship when people are in conflict, to bring about a genuine reconciliation, not just a compromise settlement. Look back at our verse, because it's talking of God's way to create relationship, of God's way of reconciliation. For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Paul's preaching didn't give us the knowledge we wanted. Paul's preaching gave us the salvation we needed. Here is what the atheist Gilbert Ryle would call a category mistake, or Thomas Kuhn, a paradigm shift. The atheist thinks the problem between God and humans is lack of information, especially lack of information provided by God to humanity. But this makes God answerable to the human court of human rationality and empiricism that we have set up. But the problem between God and humanity is not lack of information, but humanity's arrogant rejection of God and God's righteous anger towards humanity. God is not obliged to answer his creatures' criticism. He's not answerable to people, especially those who think they're in charge and reject him. The problem is not a lack of information, but human sinfulness and God's anger. We've turned our back on God, our Maker. We've chosen to run our own life, our own way without him. We've chosen to make up the rules for ourselves. We've chosen to rebel against him. We've chosen to ignore him. And then we've had the gall to complain when he chooses to leave us alone to our own folly. God chooses not to be known by human cleverness, but by reconciling his enemies, by saving his creatures from our folly. So in our verse, it pleased God, through the folly of what we preach, to save those who believe. For Paul's message appeared foolish, folly, but was powerful. For Paul preached Christ and him crucified. Folly to the arrogant wisdom of the world, but salvation to the humble believers. See, the impact of the cross is a little lost in us, for we forget what the cross was about. Romans used crucifixion to tyrannize the conquered into submission, a little bit like IS using beheadings publicly shown on videos for the world to see. It was more than a painful way to die, crucifixion. It was a shameful way to die. It was a political statement of Roman power and of your defeat, weakness and humiliation. For nothing looks much more defeated than a naked man trussed up on a stake, left to die in public ignominy. To talk of the power of the cross is perverse and paradoxical. How can somebody who is crucified be powerful? How can his crucifixion save anybody else? How could it be possibly powerful? How can the message of the crucifixion save any? Both the Jew and the Greek, as with the modern atheist, looks for the wrong thing. They have the wrong diagnosis of the human obstacle between God and man. They thought, as people still think, that the obstacle between God and humanity is information lack, is need for evidence. Whereas throughout the Bible and all down the history of Israel's prophets, we're told that the obstacle is our sin and God's justice. Our sin has destroyed our relationship with God. We've rebelled against him, and true to his character, he's rightly angry with us. More wisdom and information will never overcome this obstacle. More miracles and signs will not overcome this obstacle. Clever people are quite capable of wrecking relationships. Cleverness does not restore relationships. The divorce rate amongst intellectuals is as high as any. Brains and education don't make for good relationships. Last year, the atheist classic scholar and writer Tom Holland wrote a good book called Dominion. It's part of his paradigm shift, for he always thought our way of life came from the Greeks and the Romans, like a good Enlightenment scholar would. But he has come to discover the crucifixion of Jesus is the basis of our civilization. He wrote, "In my morals and ethics, I have learnt to accept that I'm not Greek and Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian." Jesus' death for our sins was God's reconciliation plan for our severed relationship with him. But it requires the humility of being in the dock and accepting God's plan for our salvation, and not sitting on the bench and requiring God to give us evidence and answer that will suit our expectations. The issue in the end is not knowledge. It's not philosophy. It's not wisdom. It's the personal spiritual issue of facing the truth. Professor Thomas Nagel, whom I mentioned a little while ago, wrote in another of his book, a book called The Last Word, he wrote, "I'm talking about the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." Bertrand Russell, raised by a Unitarian grandmother, never really heard the message of the cross and reconciliation, of forgiveness and pardon, of grace. He only heard of morality, of the deism of godless Christianity. He, of course, was a terrible, immoral, adulterous user of women, a self-deceived liar. His daughter became a Christian, reading his books and realizing she had everything he taught her to have, but his answers did not mean what life was about. His 4 marriages, his inability to listen to the message or to her discussions with him. You see, you can't get to know God by purposely shutting your eyes to him, by sitting in judgment on him as if you're God, but only by accepting his death for your sin. We invite people to become Christians often, and when we invite people to become Christians, the invitation is to a prayer. You see, the kind of prayer you need to pray to become a Christian is an acknowledgement that you are not worthy to be accepted by God. I don't deserve your gift of eternal life. I'm guilty of rebelling against you and ignoring you, and I need forgiveness. That's the beginning of finding God. Thanking God for sending his Son to die for me and that I may be forgiven. Thank you that he rose to give me new life. That's the gospel message. The way to know God is to approach him and say, "Please forgive me," and change me, that I may live with Jesus as my Lord.